Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are, because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this is part 3 of Riot City. Yeah! This is a little episode I'm calling Vocal Shrapnel. Have fun, guys. Alright, so closing out my trilogy on the Baltimore Riot of 1861 and exploring the idea that much of it, and much of the Civil War for that matter, could have been staged affairs used to sell an agenda through the reporting in the Baltimore Sun, who would have been one of the few contemporary sources used in shaping what we understand about this event today. Right? And so I have a few last bits of ephemera, a little shrapnel, to share before I wrap this up. So let's jump right in with a little levity. Right? I found this ad for the almighty dollar. Lewis & Company original $1 store, which I thought was funny because $1 in 1861 equals $35 today, right? So I have a feeling that Lewis & Company's $35 store didn't last too long on the corner of Baltimore and Light Streets either. Right? So next up, and I thought this was really amazing, right? During the Sun's coverage on the meeting at Monument Square, which happened right in front of a Masonic hall, right? They share with the reader the remarks of the Honorable John E. Wethered, who was allegedly at an ad hoc peace conference to help quell the violence in Baltimore. And he shares a bit of conversation that occurred between the Honorable Mr. Barringer of North Carolina and the apparently not so honorable Mr. Crowninshield of Massachusetts. Crowninshield? Are you kidding me? Right, my first thought was, this can't be real, right? It's just too perfect. The script writers, the gatekeepers, they're just having a laugh, right? It had to be. But sure enough, the Crowninshields were one of Massachusetts's earliest founding families, allegedly of German origins, and with this name, I wonder which German family they sprang out of, right? And they settle in and become the founding family of all places, Salem, Massachusetts. Not the same Salem, Massachusetts that George Peabody, founder of the Peabody Institute and mentor to the Big Jipper, comes from. Not that Salem, Mass. Yep, right? And these Crowninshields were Federalists through and through. Not only do they single-handedly set up Salem as a seafaring and shipping center, they're very active in the military and in politics. They become admirals and secretaries of the Navy and War. They marry into presidential bloodlines, as they do with the Adams bloodline. And they're also very influential in the literary world. I wonder just how influential they were, right? And this Crowninshield family needs a whole lot more work. They're essentially American royalty that you've never heard of, right? And I found 2 prospective members who might be this Crowninshield, in the forms of Benjamin W. Crowninshield and his cousin Caspar. But upon inspection, it appears that neither of them was this guy, right? So let's start with Benji, right? He doesn't enlist until November 18th, 1861. I just love those 11s, right? And so this is not until 7 months after the Baltimore riot, right? So this couldn't be him, could it, right? But you know how influential the Crowninshields must have been if one can enlist as a lieutenant and rise up to colonel in less than 4 years. And the gatekeepers don't offer up much on Benji after the war, right? He's quite boring after the war. The most interesting and fat sense tingling thing about him is that he dies in Rome. And I find that very interesting. And so then there's his cousin Caspar, whose college roommate at Harvard, of course he went to Harvard, was Robert Gould Shaw, whose alleged exploits as colonel of the 1st All-Black Military Unit would be immortalized in the Indoctrinators' approved masterpiece, Glory, right? And Shaw was a member of Harvard's oldest secret society, the Porcelain Club. Though I didn't see any Crowninshields on the gatekeepers' list of members, there's no doubt in my mind that they were members of this and perhaps other Harvard secret societies, right? But regardless, the question is, was Caspar in Baltimore or Maryland on that fateful April 19th day? And the gatekeepers tell us that he was a private when the war first started. So if the first bloodshed was during the Baltimore riot, then it stands to reason that he would have been a private. But was the 4th Battalion in Maryland or Baltimore? Unbelievably, the Sun doesn't give the number of the Massachusetts regiment in town that day at all, which is very strange, considering the level of detail that just about everything else is given. How'd they miss that? Right? But it wasn't the 4th, right, who were busy shoring up Fortress Monroe in Virginia. It was the 6th Massachusetts Volunteer Militia in Baltimore that day, because of course it was the 6th, right? And when verifying this, a very curious detail revealed itself to me, right? Before sending their troops into what they knew was hostile territory, Colonel Jones and General Davis, who I guess were the bigwigs in charge that day, consulted with the president of the Philadelphia and Baltimore Railroad, who controlled the President Street Station, regarding the situation in Baltimore. A man named Samuel Morse Felton, a native of Saugus, Massachusetts, which is interesting because this is the same place that the American progenitor of the Crown and Shield family in America first lays his roots. Johannes Caspar Richter von Kronenschild moves to Boston in like 1688, and he marries this Elizabeth Allen, right? We've never heard the name Allen before in this show. And they get married in Lynn, Massachusetts, which was originally incorporated in 1629 as Saugus. And this Spring Pond location, bordering Lynn, Peabody, and Salem, is very interesting, not only for what it could mean for the story of Mud City down the line, but also given what we know about who else was from the neighborhood, right? Is it just my apophenia running wild, or are some of these connections getting crazier and crazier? Because if Benji, or his cousin, the Friendly Ghost, weren't in Maryland or Baltimore that day, then who is this? Seeing the military and commercial and political importance of this Crown and Shield family, it had to be a member of this branch. It just had to be. But these are the only two who the gatekeepers are telling me would have been capable of being present at that event, right? Unless there are other militarily important Crown and Shields out there that aren't connected to this story, and there could be, but my fat senses are telling me that I just caught them adjusting the story of the Crown and Shields to make sure that they weren't there. And why would they need to do that? I really have no idea, but maybe the Crown and Shields wanted to lower their historical profile, like a lot of the families of Baltimore. You know, the Carrolls, the Howards, the McKims, like they've done. Right? When was the last time you heard the name Crown and Shield in regards to American history? I thought so. But regardless, we have a Crown and Shield representing the North at this peace conference who, when asked by the Southern delegate, right, if the North was not willing for all the Southern states to go, replies, "Not ale." And I like to think of this as a drunk or laudanum up typesetter's typo. It's dark, the typeset is tiny, he's wasted, right? But regardless, the intention is not all, right? And this is where this gets interesting, because Mr. Crown and Shield is quoted as saying not all, but not which states he's not willing to let go of. Because what follows these quotes, you know, Washington City was in Maryland, and there were all the archives of the government, and the North would not give that up. Nor Maryland, for Baltimore was a large commercial and manufacturing city with healthful climate, and like which it would take the South a half-century to build up, and the North would not let that go. All of this is the Sun implying that Mr. Crown and Shield says this, right? This is either the writer's or the editor's perspective coming here when he's talking about Washington, D.C. It's the Sun that wants people to know that Washington City was in Maryland, and in perhaps a brilliant bit of sleight of hand, they lead with that's where all the archives of the government are, right? And that the North would not give that up, right? And I read that, and I was like, archives of the government? What kind of archives can any government run out of Washington, D.C. have accrued, right? In 1861, Washington, D.C. is only 47 years old, thanks to William Winder, right? And I would think anything archived in D.C. after 1814 would have or should have copies in other important libraries or whatever, right? I mean, how much great shit did America accomplish between 1814 and 1861, right? This is total bullshit. This is the bait to set up the real reason that Lincoln wants to turn guns on free Americans, right? That Baltimore was a large commercial and manufacturing city with healthy climate, and like which it would take the South a half-century to build up, and the North would not let that go. This cannot be quoted to Crown and Shield. Why not? It seems easy to put quotes on there, right? This is forced perspective, right? And even if he did say all of this, which Crown and Shield is he? Right? This whole Crown and Shield story is very strange because it's not lost on me that the Crown and Shields have the Worm Knight helmet. Of course they're Worm Knights. All right, but moving on, we got to keep this thing rolling. Included in all the arms deals the city had going on during the riot, I'd be remiss in my duty if I failed to mention the centrifugal steam gun the city bought from Mr. Dickinson. It's a predecessor to the Gatling gun, and it was capable of shooting hundreds of musket balls a minute. I forgot the street that they stationed this on, but they had it strategically placed, right? And the best part about this purchase is that they never used it, making it either the best or the worst arms deal the city made that day, depending on your perspective. All right, so now I think it's time that we heard from William P. Preston, Esquire. Don't you? And so I'm not going to read his whole speech here, just a small portion. But keep in mind that allegedly somebody wrote this whole speech down in a notebook as it was being spoken, and that's how it's so well preserved. And not that a copy editor at the Sun had a written copy in advance to work from. But regardless, he begins, "Fellow citizens, I come to this meeting as a spectator, but you have solicited an expression of my sentiments. The occasion is a most extraordinary one, and I shall not hesitate to promptly respond to your call." And respond he does. Right? He spends the next few minutes getting the crowd all riled up, talking about God and country and the allegiance we should all feel to our flag and how disrespectful it is what the northern states are doing to our glorious flag. So he says that, right, it may give a pang to the heart to know that they are our countrymen, right, the northern people who are disrespecting the flag, right, that in common with ourselves, they have hitherto hailed the same glorious flag. But that flag ought not to be made the banner of fanaticism. If it be, it becomes the duty of every true man to tear it from the blackened grasp of the dastard who pollutes it. And so what he's saying is like the northern people are completely disrespecting our values, the values our country was built on, and so forth. Right? They are fanatics. Right? They have turned the flag into a banner of fanaticism. Right? And it's now every true man's job to rip that flag from anybody who's carrying it, because there's a new flag in town. Right? But the old flag is emblematic of a union created in peace and holy brotherhood, and founded upon equal rights. A union which I have loved, which I have adored, and to which he believes has passed away, right? Or has been perverted to purposes for which it never was designed. I cannot countenance its perversion, or, under the shelter of its former glory, submit to present degradation. It doesn't matter that flag once stood for great things. It's not standing for great things anymore, not in the present. Right? The honored flag, which long on land and sea has been its glorious emblem, I shall forever love and cherish, aye, though it be in fanatic hands. Right? He still loves that flag, though, man. He grew up with that flag. He loves it. Right? The distinction, however, between the flag and the hand that bears it is broad and marked. The flag, all brightness, glory, and unsullied honor. The hand, begrimed and black and treacherous. And this was met with applause and cheers, right? And a voice in the crowd, who I'm sure was in no way associated with William P. Preston, Esquire, asks, "What are your opinions on the crisis?" Right? To which he responds, "This is not the time or the place for arguments or discussions. We are here to allay, if possible, the fierceness of civil strife, or, if need be, to stem the torrent of fanaticism, which seeks to devastate our land and desolate our homes, which has already stained our streets with blood." And so here we really see an effort to sell the stars and bars, which brings me right to my next bit of shrapnel. The Monday Sun reports that secession badges and flags of the Southern Confederacy have grown within the last 48 hours into universal demand. And their sale brings money to the pockets of scores of boys. Scores, multiple. So something like 60 to 100 kids, right? Who cry them vociferously through the streets from morning till night. "Get your Confederate flags here! Get your badge here!" It's just unbelievable. It's just unbelievable, right? These flags and badges are printed on satin or pasteboard, and that a great number of Confederate flags have been flung out, right? If Sumner only fell like a month ago, and Virginia only seceded very recently, how is there all this Confederate memorabilia floating around Baltimore City for these kids to be selling all over the place? Right? The stars and bars only came into being a month and a half before, right? In Alabama, of all places. Fort Morgan, anyone? Right? And in barely over a month, flag and badge manufacturers, families like the McKims, perhaps, And the McKims have their own connection to the Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore Railroad, the same railroad company in charge of the President Street Station. I mean, how unbelievable is that? Apophenia running wild! The narrative wants us to believe that these manufacturers had thousands of Confederate flags and badges ready to go for the weekend of April 19th. The manufacturers, whoever they were going to need some form of heads up in order to fill such a massive order if they were to have him ready to go for a specific date like the 19th. There's just no way city manufacturers stopped production on Friday afternoon or whatever, right? Magicked up templates for this shit and had it printed out and hit in the streets in enough time to sell any of it. Right? It takes time to fill these orders. None of these Confederate flags or badges was going to be worth anything on Sunday or Monday. So if someone can explain to me how this would be possible in 1861, I'm all ears, right? Local manufacturers were handed the design in advance and were told to have the product ready. There's no doubt about it in my mind, right? Even just a few days' notice might be all they would need. And that the stars and bars is based on the Austrian flag is just another mundane detail. The dude who designed it was Austrian. Has nothing to do with the fact that these people have roots there, right? And that the only thing keeping this individual from being monarch there during the Civil War is her sex.
That's a woman?
Are you kidding me? Right? We have the Confederate flag's origin in the House of Hanover, and we have a German family named Crowninshield representing the North. You tell me if you think there was any staging going on. Because the more I look at all of this, it becomes just as scripted as William P. Preston's off-the-cuff remarks. And so moving on in the Monday, April 22nd, Sun, they tell us that though the main fighting had ceased by Friday night, long after the last of the Northern troops were vanquished, citizens were still freaking out and looking for ways to protect themselves. The city councils and Colonel Isaac's 900 of Hall's patent rifles and Garrett's auction house guns just weren't enough, apparently, and any place that someone thought there was a rifle was burglared, right? Even armories. Allegedly, thousands of guns were stolen over the weekend. Stellar work done by the city council and their appropriated funds, right? They also want us to let us know that churches were sparsely attended because everyone was in front of City Hall looking for a gun, right? And in perhaps one of my favorite bits, saving the best for last, right? And so in the reporting of the Saturday Morning Sun, the riot is on, right? And from Gay to South Streets on Pratt, the fight with the soldiers who marched, or rather ran, through town was terrific. Large paving stones were hurled into the ranks from every direction. Hence, terrific, right? The people of Baltimore were really sticking it to them Union soldiers. So much so that the Negroes who were about the wharf, in many instances, joining in the assault. Now, why would they do that? Right? Weren't the Union soldiers fighting for the cause of abolition? Why would they throw bricks at them? I could understand maybe not helping them, but throwing bricks at them? They're trying to free the slaves. Even though the conflict they present as the Civil War had very little to do with slavery, it is often presented as a, if not the, determining factor of the war. It's the part that sticks with people, right? The North won and freed the slaves and everybody lived happily ever after, right? But one of the secret outcomes of the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation is that by eliminating the slave class, the industrialists essentially forced the federal government into creating the working class, where business owners no longer had to carry the burden of ownership over their workforce. Remember, at least in industrialized cities like Baltimore, what we think of as 19th century slaves actually had it pretty good, right? According to the meticulous records of David Telfair McKim, right, they had 3 hots and a cot, regular work hours with paid overtime, and they had discretionary sick or vacation time as well. And so I'm guessing that if the wharf Negroes were throwing bricks at the Union soldiers, it's because they recognized that the abolitionists were trying to put them out on the street, making them job and homeless, right? Because the real sleight of hand trick about the abolitionist movement and the alleged ending of slavery in America is that by putting the focus on one people and creating such horrific associations around it, right, and how good it is that it's over, they made it so that very few people will recognize that it never ended at all, right? It just changed names. Ownership of the workforce transferred to the federal government, making slaves of us all. All right, so that's it for my Riot City trilogy and my exploration around the idea that some of these things could have been staged. And so I'm not saying or trying to convince anyone that the Civil War was more farce than fierce. I'm just exploring the idea that there's more to the story than the mainstream narrative pushers with their textbooks and museum exhibits and entertainments are telling us about these events. And so to close it all out with a small cherry that will hopefully act as a bridge back to my publisher's clearinghouse, Aruna Shepherdson Abel, whose name literally means capable shepherd of the sun, wasn't the first person to start a newspaper named after old Saul Invictus. Our boy John Murray, patriarch of the Murray publishing dynasty, had the idea first. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this little trilogy on the Baltimore Riot of 1861 as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you. Remember, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies, right? So until the next one, cheers.